this, we got the volume on this?
Fine.
Is that good? That's good? Okay, great. So, actually, this isn't my first time to Fort Wayne. A couple of years ago, I came through here, and Matt Demerit, who's here today, a local researcher, had been hosting me, and he'd been trying to arrange a lecture for me at a local college, right?
Right. IDFW.
Yeah, and he had made some progress towards that, but at a certain point, I got forbidden, right? So I couldn't call myself the forbidden archaeologist. I didn't get forbidden a couple times a year. So, but this time I'm back and ready to go with this group here. It seems like Fort Wayne is becoming a center of alternative history. So it sounds like there's plans to increase the fame of Fort Wayne in this area. So glad that's happening. So today I'm going to talk about my topic, forbidden archaeology, evidence for extreme human antiquity. And like some of the other researchers, I have in the background a spiritual tradition. I'm a researcher in human origins for the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. And my work is inspired by my studies in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. Just as others, they may have other spiritual sources for their work in alternative archaeology and alternative history. So many people today would say that's a bit unusual to be mixing spirituality or science and religion. But actually, I have found that there is an element, even within the mainstream academic community, that is open to hearing such presentations. I've been invited to present my Vedic ideas about human origins and antiquity at some of the leading scientific institutions in the world, such as the Royal Institution in London, the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow, the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. So there are elements, even within the mainstream scientific and academic world, that are open to considering some of these alternative perspectives. Now, the question I'm specifically dealing with in this presentation is, how old is the human species? And today, the most common answers to those questions come from the modern followers of Charles Darwin. And some of my friends from India tell me, Michael, maybe you're a reincarnation of Charles Darwin, and you've taken birth again to correct your mistake. So I kind of laughed a little bit when I first heard that, too. I didn't know what to think about it. Now I'm starting to wonder even myself. So according to the standard theories that are taught in high schools and universities around the world, the first humans like us came into existence about 150,000 years ago, perhaps as much as 200,000 years ago. And they would say before that there were no humans like us. There were only more primitive ape-like human ancestors. However, the ancient Sanskrit writings in India and the writings of many other ancient wisdom traditions tell us that humans have existed for millions of years on Earth, going all the way back to the very beginnings of the history of life. So I wondered about that, and I thought, well, if that's true, I could make a prediction. Because we have to think, is a proposal like that true or not? If it is true, then I would predict there should be reports of archaeological evidence for humans existing much further back in time than 150,000 years ago, perhaps going back many millions of years. So here's my methodology for testing that prediction. I decided to examine all archaeological reports from the time of Darwin up to the present, and not just in English. I have a reading knowledge of German, French, Italian, Russian, Spanish. I have a reading knowledge of about a dozen major languages. So I decided to look at all of the archaeological reports, not just what's in the textbooks, but what's in the original archaeological reports. And that took me about 8 years of solid research. Now, I had two basic findings as a result of that 8 years of research. My first finding is not so surprising. There are no reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the current secondary literature. I divide the scientific literature into two parts. The primary scientific literature, by that I mean the original reports by geologists, archaeologists, other earth scientists, published in the professional scientific literature. By secondary literature, I mean textbooks, survey studies that are based on the primary literature. So my first finding was there are no reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the current secondary literature, such as textbooks. Now my second finding was a little more interesting. There are many reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the primary scientific literature, past and present. So I collected all of those reports and put them together in this 900-page book, which some people call forbidding archaeology, because it's just such a huge book, you don't even feel like picking it up. But and that book was basically directed at the scientific world. And actually, it was reviewed in most of the professional journals that deal with human origins and antiquity. Now, of course, it was a very controversial book, so there were lots of different reactions, some of them quite negative, as you might expect. But surprisingly, there were some, even within the mainstream academic circles, that were finding some good things to say about this book. For example, the historian of science, David Olduvai, wrote in Social Studies of Science, and it was a 21-page review article about the book, not just a short review of 1 or 2 pages, but he had 21 pages to give his ideas about the book. And he asked, has forbidden archaeology made any contribution to the literature on paleoanthropology? That's the scientific discipline that deals with human origins. And he said, our answer is a guarded yes, for 2 reasons. He said, first of all, this is a quote from him, much of the historical material has not been scrutinized in such detail before. So as a professional historian of science, specializing in this particular area of research, he said he'd encountered nobody among the professional historians of science who had gone into the history of archaeology in such depth before. And second, he said, the book raises, quote, a central problematic regarding the lack of certainty in scientific truth claims. In other words, scientists make different truth claims. They attach different levels of certainty to their theories. You know, some theories they say are very probable, some theories they say are absolutely certain in terms of their truth value. And their theories about human origins in antiquity are some of the theories to which they attach the highest level of certainty in terms of its truth. And David Olduvai had thought we had done a good job in problematizing, attaching that level of certainty to the current theories of human origins and antiquity. So I thought that was good, that even people within the professional circles were recognizing what was going on with this book, Forbidden Archaeology, which, as I said, was 900 pages long. And for that, for some people, that was a little bit too much. So we brought out a shorter edition of the book called The Hidden History of the Human Race. But it's an interesting fact that the larger book continues to sell better than the shorter edition of the book, because it seems like those who are interested in these topics, they want all the information. So, of course, here I'm speaking at the Ancient Mysteries Conference. Sometimes I talk on coast-to-coast radio. And some people would think, some people within the world would think, well, that's where this stuff belongs. It belongs in these little conferences for people who are interested in, how can we say, strange things. And, it's for some sensationalistic radio shows and sensationalistic TV shows like Ancient Aliens, which I've appeared on. However, I have also ventured into the mainstream scientific circles to present these same ideas. I've given over 30 papers at mainstream international conferences on archaeology and anthropology. The first time I did that was in 1994, the year after Forbidden Archaeology was published. I thought archaeologists should hear this. So I proposed a paper for a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress, which is one of the world's largest international organizations of professional archaeologists. And I presented a paper there. I proposed a paper called Puranic Time of the Archaeological Record. So the Puranas are the historical writings of ancient India. And they talk of vast cycles of time, going millions of years, like the Mayan calendar involves vast cycles of time. Different ancient wisdom traditions talk about vast cyclical concepts of time. So the Puranas, the historical writings of ancient India, also contain a cyclical concept of time, with cycles lasting millions of years. And they say humans have been present throughout all those vast cycles of time. So I presented a paper, proposed a paper, Puranic Time in the Archaeological Record, to show that there is archaeological evidence showing that humans have been present throughout all these vast cycles of time that are described in the Puranas. Now, they didn't have to accept the paper. And the academic committee of the conference, they accepted it for presentation. So I went to New Delhi. I thought, the World Archaeological Congress, it meets every 4 years. in a different country. And that year it happened to be in India. So I thought, this is the perfect time and place to present the ideas that I'm talking about. So the paper was accepted. I went to New Delhi and I presented the paper. There's a younger version of me, the 1994 edition of Moulin-Quignon. And not only that, not only was I able to present the paper, it was later selected for publication in the official conference proceedings. There were several books that came out from that conference. One of them was a volume called Time and Archaeology, edited by the archaeologist Tim Murray. And this book was published by Routledge, which is a major scientific publisher in England. So, sometimes, people ask me, do you have peer-reviewed scientific publications? And the answer is yes, and this is one of them. So, I think it's important for people to understand that there is an element within the scientific world. There is an element that's very much opposed to what I'm doing. That is a fact. A very strong, powerful element within the scientific community that is opposed to these things. But the scientific community itself is not monolithic. There are people who, within the scientific world, who are open to new ideas and are willing to listen to them. They may not agree with them right at the present moment, but at least they're willing to listen and they're willing to provide a forum for new ideas to be presented. And actually my latest book, My Science, My Religion, is a collection of 24 papers that I presented on these topics at mainstream scientific and academic conferences. And some of them have been published in peer-reviewed scientific publications. But anyways, getting back to the topic of forbidden archaeology, as I said, I did all this research. I found in the primary scientific literature all of these reports of archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity. So a question arose in my mind: why is this evidence not in the secondary literature? If it's in the original scientific literature, the primary scientific literature, why is it not in the secondary literature, the textbooks? And I think it's because of a process of what I call knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. We can call that a blue box there, the knowledge filter, and what it represents is the current dominant consensus in the scientific world about this topic of human origins and antiquity. And what we find is that reports of evidence that conform to the consensus will pass through that intellectual filter very easily, which means you'll see this information in textbooks, you'll hear scientists talking about it. But if we've got evidence that radically contradicts the dominant consensus, it tends to be filtered out. And this is not necessarily what some people would call a conspiracy theory. This is how some people within the mainstream academic circles will try to dismiss, the kinds of things that are being discussed at a conference like this. They'll just say, oh, those folks have got a conspiracy theory. Now, I think conspiracies do exist, but there's also something that many people in the mainstream academic community will also admit if pressed. That happens. Historians of science and philosophers of science for a long time have understood that theoretical preconceptions can influence how a community of scientists will react to different types of evidence that come to their attention. And the things that kind of go along with the dominant ideas, they get a pass. The things that radically contradict the dominant consensus, they tend to inspire neglect. Let's set that aside. Let's forget about that. Let's don't talk about that. And in some cases, there are examples of outright suppression and what we might call conspiracy. But there's a whole range of things that happen under this knowledge filtering process. And some people within the academic world, they dismissed forbidden archaeology as just another, quote, conspiracy theory. But there were others within the academic world who kind of understood it in a different way. One of them was the archaeologist Marilyn Patumati, who wrote a review of forbidden archaeology in L'Anthropologie, which is one of the main academic journals. It's published in French, but for over a century or century and a half, it's been one of the primary academic publications in anthropology. And she wrote, and I'm translating from the French, Cremo and Thompson, who's my forbidden archaeology co-author, have written a provocative work that raises the problem of the influence of the dominant ideas of a time period on scientific research. These ideas can compel the researchers to orient their analyses according to the conceptions that are permitted by the scientific community. So she was kind of recognizing what we were proposing in terms of our knowledge filtration idea. And it's something, as I said, that some people within the scientific world, they understand and appreciate that these things actually do happen. Now, I'm going to give some examples. There was a case that was mentioned by another speaker here a little earlier today, the case of Virginia Steen McIntyre, who's a geologist that I personally know. In the 1970s and late 1960s, she was involved in dating an archaeological site in Mexico called Hueyatlaco. And it's in central Mexico near the town of Puebla. And archaeologists there discovered human artifacts. And they may look simple, but they're the type of artifacts that archaeologists attribute to humans like us. And the excavation was done very professionally. This is the excavation at Hueyatlaco. And the artifacts were photographed in place in the layers of rock in which they were found. And the archaeologists wanted to know how old these things were. So they called a team of geologists to date the site. So Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues came, and they used 4 different scientific methods to date the site. I'll mention a couple of them here. In the same layers with the stone tools, animal bones were found with butchering marks on them. So the geologists used the uranium-thorium method to date those butchered animal bones, and they got an age of 245,000 years, and that age was published in this scientific journal. And then above the layer with the stone tools and the butchered animal bones was a layer of volcanic ash. And they used the zircon fission track method to date that layer of ash. They got an age of 270,000 years. So using all 4 methods that they employed, the geologists said the site had to be at least 245,000 years old. But the archaeologist said that can't be true. according to their ideas, human beings capable of making the artifacts didn't exist anywhere in the world 245,000 years ago. And what to speak of being present in North America. One of the earlier speakers mentioned that the current idea is that humans haven't been present in North America any more than 10 or 15,000 years, and some are kind of now struggling with maybe 20 or 25,000 years, but 245,000 years, impossible. So the archaeologists refused to publish the age for the site given by their own hand-picked team of geologists. So Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues were shocked by that. They just thought, well, we're just geologists doing our science. We can't help it if it overthrows your ideas about human origins and antiquity in North America. And so what the geologists decided to do was independently publish the age for the site, and they went ahead and did that. But when they did that, they experienced an extreme negative backlash from their colleagues in the scientific world. Virginia Steen McIntyre lost a teaching position that she held at a university. She had been a rising star in her profession up to this point. She'd invented a new dating method. She was getting invitations to speak at major international scientific conferences. She was getting grant money. After she did this, all that stopped. And the scientific world went completely silent about this site until in 1993, Richard Thompson and I wrote about it in Forbidden Archaeology, and that inspired some new research in this place, which has not only confirmed the dates originally proposed by Virginia Steen McIntyre, but as Frank Joseph was mentioning a little earlier, even extended the dates back a little bit further. So Virginia Steen McIntyre wrote to one of the editors that published the report that she and her colleagues submitted, giving the date. Not being an anthropologist, I didn't realize how deeply woven into our thought the current theory of human evolution has become. Our work at Hueyatlaco has been rejected by most archaeologists because it contradicts that theory, period. It's an example of how this knowledge filtering process works. So, in my research, I deal with cases from the 20th century, the 21st century, but also cases from the earlier history of archaeology. So this is a case from the earlier history of archaeology. It has to do with Jacques Boucher de Perthes, who in the 19th century in France was one of the founders of modern archaeology. And at a place called Moulin-Quignon near Abbeville in the Somme River Valley in northeastern France, he found in one of his excavations an anatomically modern human jawbone. And he found it in this layer of his excavation, along with many stone tools and weapons. And according to modern geologists, this layer at Moulin-Quignon is about 430,000 years old. So it was really quite old. Now, even at the time, in the 19th century, it was a really controversial discovery, and there was a lot of debate about the discovery. And many scientists concluded this cannot possibly be true. So they began to claim, well, here's what probably happened. somebody must have gone to some Roman cemetery, pulled out a jawbone about 2,000 years old, and then they must have gone to the excavations and planted it there for Boucher de Perec to find. And actually, that is the story that we see in the textbooks today about this discovery. But what we don't see in the textbooks is that after he heard these kinds of accusations, Boucher de Perec went out and made additional excavations in the same site. And these new excavations were made under conditions that completely ruled out this hoax kind of hypothesis that some had come up with, because these new excavations were witnessed by other professional scientists. And in these new excavations, they uncovered 100 additional anatomically modern human bones and teeth from the same formations. So I think what we have here is evidence that humans like us were existing over 400,000 years ago in northern Europe. And I presented a paper on this topic at the 20th International Congress for History of Science. And this paper was later published in the peer-reviewed conference proceedings volumes. So sometimes, people ask, do you have peer-reviewed academic publications? And the answer is yes. Now, in the early 20th century, an interesting discovery was made in South America, in Buenos Aires. An anatomically modern human skull cap, the top part of the skull, was found in an excavation at Buenos Aires. The excavation had gone down about 45 feet from the surface. At that level, the excavators encountered a layer of thick limestone rock, which they call in Spanish tosca, it means hard. And they broke through that level, and at that level they found the skull cap. And the formation at this level is called the Pre-Encenadan Formation. And according to modern geologists, it's about 1.5 million years old. So this discovery was reported to the scientific world by Dr. Florentino Ameghino, a prominent Argentine scientist. And I talked about this case in this paper that I presented at a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress that was held in Cape Town, South Africa in 1999. Now, a lot of interesting discoveries have been made at a place called Olduvai Gorge in Africa. Many people are not aware of the first discovery that was made at Olduvai Gorge. In 1913, the German scientist Hans Reck reported that an almost complete anatomically modern human skeleton had been found at Olduvai Gorge. And it was found in upper bed 2 of Olduvai Gorge. And according to modern geologists, bed 2 of Olduvai Gorge goes from about 1.15 to 1.7 million years ago. So this discovery, if it's in the upper part of bed 2, it has to be over 1.15 million years old. And it's anatomically modern. And Reck said that it was solidly embedded in the rock, and that he had to use hammers and chisels to get the skeleton out of the rock. Now, it was a very controversial discovery. There were decades of debate about this discovery. And the discovery was made in the early part of the 20th century, but throughout the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, scientists all over the world were arguing about this skeleton. And in the 1960s, some people thought the debate was finally settled when a German scientist named Rainer Proch did a radiocarbon date, a carbon-14 date, on what he said were some fragments of bone from the skeleton that Reck had discovered at Olduvai Gorge. And he got an age of less than 10,000 years. So many people, and in the textbooks today, you'll see that that is the resolution given, that it's really not over 1 million years old, it's less than 10,000 years old. I've got a couple of problems with that resolution of this controversy. The first problem is this. Reck's skeleton was being kept in a museum in Germany. And the museum was bombed during World War II, and the skeleton was destroyed. So, where did Rainer Proch get the bones? You know, he said, I found in another museum a box that had a few little slivers of bone in that I think were bones from that original skeleton. So he used those to do his dating. And then the second problem is this. In the 1990s, Rainer Proch was forced to resign his position as an anthropology professor at Frankfurt University when an academic court there found him guilty of falsifying dozens of radiocarbon dates during his long career there. So I don't think that a radiocarbon date by Rainer Proch on a sliver of bone that may not have even been from the original skeleton really solves this whole problem. I think the best information we have about the age of that skeleton is the report by the original investigator who said it was solidly embedded in upper bed 2 of Olduvai Gorge. It's an interesting case from England going back to the mid-19th century. Dr. Robert H. Collier reported that an anatomically modern human jaw had been found 16 feet deep in the Red Crag Formation at a place called Foxhall in England in the year 1855. And Foxhall is located on the outskirts of the city of Ipswich in eastern England, a little north of London. And according to modern geologists, the Red Crag Formation is late Pliocene. It means it's about from 2 to 3 million years old. So there we have evidence for a human presence going back 2 or 3 million years. And going back to the 20th century, in 1979, Mary Leakey of the famous Leakey family, she was the wife of Louis Leakey, announced the discovery of footprints at a place called Laetoli in the country of Tanzania in eastern Africa. And, you know, the footprints were found in layers of solidified volcanic ash that had been dated using the potassium argon method as being about 3.6 or 3.7 million years old. And in her original report published in National Geographic magazine, Mary Leakey said, the Laetoli footprints are indistinguishable from modern human footprints. They look like the footprints you or I would make if we were walking on a beach today. Other scientists also agreed. The paleontologist Tim White wrote make no mistake about it, they are like modern human footprints. Now, neither Mary Leakey nor Tim White believe that those footprints were made by human beings like us. According to their theories, such humans did not exist over 3 million years ago. So, how did they explain the footprints? Well, they said there must have existed some type of ape man who had feet exactly like modern human feet. And that is how the footprints got made. So that's an interesting idea. Unfortunately, there isn't any scientific evidence to support it. Scientists have the skeletons of the ape men who existed between 3 and 4 million years ago. They're called Australopithecus. And foot bones of Australopithecus have been discovered at a place called Sterkfontein in South Africa. And the foot skeleton of Australopithecus is not like that of a modern human being. It's like that of a chimpanzee with long toes, sort of like long human fingers, and a first toe that can move out to the side like a human thumb. Actually, the only creature known to science that has a foot exactly like that of a modern human being is a modern human being. So, what did Mary Leakey actually find? I think she found evidence that humans like us were existing between 3 and 4 million years ago in East Africa. And I talked about that case in this paper presented at a meeting of the European Association of Archaeologists. And papers like this you'll find included in my new book, My Science, My Religion. Now, some people might say, okay, footprints are a little bit ambiguous. It would be better if there were human skeletons that age, between 3 and 4 million years old. And such things have been reported in the primary scientific literature. In the late 19th century, the Italian geologist Giuseppe Ragazzoni found several human skeletons at a place called Castenedolo in northern Italy. He found them in layers of rock that modern geologists say are between 4 and 5 million years old. Now, I went to that village of Castenedolo. It's in the foothills of the Alps in northern Italy. And I met this gentleman there in the village. I gave him a copy of the Italian edition of my book, The Hidden History of the Human Race. And in exchange, he gave me a copy of a very rare 19th century geological report about the discoveries at Castenedolo. And from the information in this report, we were able to locate the place where the original excavations were made. So it should be possible to do more research there. But, when some scientists hear that an anatomically modern human skeleton has been found in layers of rock 4 million years old, they say, this is very easy to explain. There's no mystery about this. Here's what probably happened. Maybe 4,000 years ago, somebody died on the surface there. His friends dug a grave, put the body down into that ancient layer of rock, and that's why you think you found a human skeleton 4 million years old. Now, things like this do happen. Technically, this is called intrusive burial. It does happen. But Ragazzoni was a professional geologist, and he was very much aware of this type of problem. And he said, if you read his original report in the Italian, as I did, he says, if it had been a burial, then the layers of rock above the skeleton would have been disturbed, as we see here. But he said, I looked very carefully when I was taking the skeleton out of the ground, and I could see that all the layers of rock above the skeleton were intact and undisturbed. And he said each layer had its own microstratification. In other words, each of these layers was made up of hundreds of smaller layers, and they were all undisturbed, which means there was not a burial, there was not an earth movement, there was not a fissure in the ground through which a modern skeleton slipped into some very ancient layer of rock, which is the usual kind of explanations that scientists try to give for these discoveries. So here we have evidence for humans existing 4 million years ago. So we've got human footprints millions of years old, human bones, human artifacts. And we're now going to jump back a little further in time. This is Carlos Ribeiro, who was head of the Geological Survey of Portugal in the late 19th century. He discovered hundreds of human artifacts in his country of Portugal in layers of rock that modern geologists tell us are about 20 million years old. And as a professional geologist, he said they cannot have come into those very ancient layers through any cracks or fissures. He was aware of that problem. He investigated it. He ruled it out. If you read his original reports published in Portuguese and French, you can see that. So he displayed these artifacts in the Museum of Geology in Lisbon, in these cases here, with labels indicating an age of about 20 million years. But if you go to the museum today, you will not see these artifacts on display anymore. Today they're kept locked in these cabinets behind me. So I went to the museum and I got permission from the director to unlock those cabinets, and I was able to study and photograph some of these 20 million year old human artifacts from Portugal, and here are some of them. And I also studied Dr. Ribeiro's original maps and field notes in the museum archives. And then I went into the countryside of Portugal and I relocated some of the places where he made his discoveries. For example, this is the quarry at Morganheira, where he found flint artifacts in layers of rock about 20 million years old, including this one. It's got a nice point on it with use marks. It's got his original label on it. It's interesting what happened. As I said, when Ribeiro was alive, he displayed these artifacts in the Museum of Geology in Lisbon with labels indicating an age of 20 million years. After he died, his colleagues in the museum did something interesting. They left the artifacts on display, but they wrote new labels for all of them. And this is the new label they wrote for the artifact I just showed you. This line gives the age. It says Paleolitico Superior. That means upper Paleolithic period. And according to archaeologists today, that upper Paleolithic period goes back about 20,000 or 30,000 years in Europe. So they thought 20 million years, that's impossible. humans cannot have existed at that time. 20 or 30,000 years, that sounds better for artifacts like this. So they wrote new labels for all of the artifacts. And then the next generation of officials in the museum just put the entire collection away. And I'm the first researcher to see them in over 50 years. So I presented a paper on these discoveries at the meeting of the European Association of Archaeologists that took place in Lisbon, Portugal in the year 2000. I thought it would be a good place to talk about these things. And that paper was later published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal on archaeology called the Journal of Iberian Archaeology. That's the journal that deals with discoveries that are made in Spain and Portugal, basically. So again, people ask, do you have peer-reviewed publications? And yes, I do. Now, one of the cases that I have always found extremely fascinating are the California gold mine discoveries. During the gold rush days, miners came to California, and to get the gold, they were digging tunnels into sides of mountains like Table Mountain, which is near the town of Sonora in Tuolumne County in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. And deep inside these tunnels, in the solid rock, the miners were finding human skeletons and human artifacts. They were finding obsidian spear points. They were finding stone mortars and pestles like these here. And what makes these things so interesting to me is that they were found in layers of rock that modern geologists tell us belong to the early part of the geological period called the Eocene, which means they would be about 50 million years old. And for many archaeologists today, this is just beyond imagination. They can't even begin to consider anything like this. Yet, that's what Dr. Whitney was reporting in the primary scientific literature. His report was published in the primary scientific literature. And just to give you a little more details about where the dating comes from in terms of modern scientific work. What we have here at Table Mountain is the bedrock. And into the bedrock are worn some ancient river channels. And those ancient river channels are filled with a conglomerate. It's a mixture of stones and pebbles and mud that is now solidified into solid rock. And those river gravels, solidified river gravels, contain plant and animal fossils that are characteristic of the early Eocene period. And it's in those same early Eocene river gravels that the human bones and artifacts were found. And those ancient river channels are covered by hundreds of feet of volcanic deposits, solid layers of volcanic rock that have been dated using the potassium argon method as being up to 33 million years old. And then there's another layer at the very top of volcanic material that's 9 million years old. So that's where the dating for these particular discoveries comes from. Now, these discoveries were reported in the professional scientific literature to the scientific world by Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was the chief government geologist of California. His report was published by Harvard University, year 1879. But we don't see these discoveries mentioned in the textbooks today because of the process of knowledge filtration. And this is the scientist most responsible for the knowledge filtering in this particular case. The anthropologist William Holmes, who worked at the Smithsonian Institution. We've heard about that a few times today. So, he wrote in one of his reports, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution, he wouldn't have published that report. He would not have come to those conclusions. In other words, if the facts did not fit the theory, they should simply have been forgotten. And basically, that's what happened. However, and a few years ago, I was a consultant for a television documentary produced by Bill Cote for NBC called The Mysterious Origins of Man. And when Bill Cote got in touch with me, I told him about these California gold mine discoveries. I also told him about Virginia Steen McIntyre. And he went and interviewed her. And it's because of that documentary that how can we call him, a philanthropist here in America decided to fund new research at Hueyatlaco and got Virginia Steen McIntyre involved in it, and that's where the new results came from. So I was happy to have played a role in that. But I also told Bill Cote about the California gold mine discoveries. And I told him he should go to the Museum of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley, because I knew that some of the artifacts from the California gold mines are still in the collection of that museum. So Bill Cote went to the museum, but the museum officials refused to allow him access to those artifacts. They're not shown to the public, but they are still there. However, we were able to find some photographs of the artifacts that Dr. Whitney had taken in the 19th century. So we did wind up with some imagery to use in that documentary. Do we have, Lori, do we have any of those mysterious origins of man? Yes, yes, we have some. We have not only the original television show, but we have all the outtakes from it as well. In other words, when Bill Cote made the original show, he interviewed me, he interviewed Richard Thompson, he interviewed a whole lot of alternative history researchers. But in this new release of this DVD, you get not just what was shown in the television release, but the complete interviews that were done with all of us. I wish they'd do the same thing for Ancient Aliens. But, we did find some photographs of the artifacts that had been taken by Dr. Whitney in the 19th century. So we did have some imagery to use in this documentary, The Mysterious Origins of Man. But it was interesting what happened when scientists who support the current dominant theories of human origins found out, that NBC was going to show this documentary. They tried to stop NBC from doing it. And they weren't successful. NBC did show it and decided to show it again. And that made these scientists extremely angry. So they tried to stop NBC at least from showing it the second time. Again, they failed to do that. So, oops, I pressed the wrong button. I finally did it. I've been doing so well up to this point.
Easy fix.
Okay, thank you. So, then this group of scientists went to the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, And they tried to get the FCC to investigate NBC. They wanted the FCC to censure NBC. They also wanted the FCC to force NBC to broadcast primetime apologies for having shown the program. And they also wanted the FCC to fine NBC millions of dollars so they would never do anything like this again. Now, I'm happy to say the FCC didn't do any of that, but I just thought it was very interesting that these kinds of attempts were made. And in my book, Forbidden Archaeology's Impact, I really document all this. I'm just showing you one letter, some excerpts from one letter by this group of scientists, but in my book, Forbidden Archaeology's Impact, I've got the whole thing really documented. So later, I went back to the museum myself. I'm a member of the World Archaeological Congress, which is one of the world's largest international organizations of archaeologists. And I made a proposal to present a paper about these California gold mine discoveries at their next meeting, which was in 2006, I think. And I made the proposal. It was accepted by the academic committee of the Congress. So then I was able to go to the officials of the museum of the University of California at Berkeley and show them that letter of acceptance. So on that basis, they decided to let me personally see the artifacts. They're not kept in the museum itself. They're kept in a storage building several miles from the museum. And I mean, sometimes, people think this idea that, in museums there are strange things that the public doesn't see. It's just something from Indiana Jones movies. But it's not just Indiana Jones movies. There is a lot of interesting stuff in the back rooms and storage rooms of museums that is not put on public display that really is very interesting. So these are some of the, these are some of the artifacts from the California gold mines. They still are in the back rooms of that museum. And then I went into the mountains of California. This is Table Mountain as it looks today. And we were able to find some of the old 19th century gold mining tunnels where these objects were originally discovered, and it may be possible to do more research there. And this is the paper that I presented on the California gold mine discoveries at, actually it's the 2003 meeting of the World Archaeological Congress that was held in Washington, D.C. Now this is a real mystery here, how all this water has gotten out of this cup. An anomalous event is happening before our eyes. Maybe there's a slight leak in it or something. At this same meeting, I invited Virginia Steen McIntyre and Sam Van Landingham, one of the scientists that was involved in the new research at Hueyatlaco, to also make presentations. So there are some opportunities for alternative researchers to make presentations to the professionals in their gatherings. So how far back in time can we go with evidence like this? In the year 1862, a scientific journal called The Geologist published an interesting report. An anatomically modern human skeleton was found 90 feet below the surface of the ground in Macoupin County, Illinois, which is not that far from here. And according to the report, above the skeleton was a thick layer of slate rock that was unbroken, which kind of rules out the intrusive burial hypothesis. And according to modern geologists of the State Geological Survey of Illinois, the layer here at this place, below the slate rock, is about 300 million years old. This interesting report from Scientific American tells of a beautiful metallic vase that was found 5 feet deep in solid rock in Dorchester, which is part of Boston in Massachusetts. And it was a beautiful metallic vase with silver inlaid floral patterns on it, according to the description. And as I said, it came from 15 feet deep in solid rock as a foundation for a building was being excavated. And according to modern geologists of the United States Geological Survey, the age of the formation at that place, at that depth, is about 600 million years old. Thanks. So, actually I could keep you here from now until Christmas, going through one case after another, but I'm not going to do that. What is the significance of evidence like this? There are hundreds of cases like this. If there were just a few, well, so what? But if there are hundreds of them, then the significance of it is that if it's to be taken at face value, it would contradict this dominant picture of human origins. And this was recognized by one of the architects of this current dominant theory of human origins, the paleoanthropologist William W. Howells of Harvard University. He's no longer living, but he got a copy of Forbidden Archaeology when it first came out early in 1993, and he read it, and he wrote me a letter. And he wrote, Forbidden Archaeology represents much careful effort in critically assembling published materials. So I thought that was good coming from a professional archaeologist, because many of them would say, like Richard Leakey said, this is just pure humbug, nobody would take it seriously but a fool, But some archaeologists did appreciate the great amount of research that went into gathering all this literature together. So he did that. And then he went on to say, most of us in the professional scientific world, mistakenly or not, I thought that was a nice admission from him. Of course, he was retired at this point, so he could be a little bit generous. But he said, most of us, mistakenly or not, see human evolution with man emerging rather late, maybe less than 200,000 years ago. And then he said, to have modern human beings appearing a great deal earlier would be devastating, not just to our theories of human origins, but to the whole theory of evolution. So I thought it was good that he acknowledged what the impact of the evidence would be if it were accepted as factual. And the he's an Australian, actually, archaeologist, Tim Murray. He wrote in his review of Forbidden Archaeology in British Journal for History of Science, Forbidden Archaeology, quote, provides the historian of archaeology with a useful compendium of case studies in the history and sociology of scientific knowledge, which can be used to foster debate within archaeology about how to describe the epistemology of one's discipline. And that's exactly what Richard Thompson and I were trying to do. Start fostering debate within archaeology about the epistemology of their discipline. So epistemology it means understanding how we get knowledge. How do we evaluate evidence? What is evidence? What is to be accepted as true and not true? What is the truth and how do we get to know it? So that is exactly what we were trying to do. Give archaeologists case studies in the history of archaeology that would ignite a little bit of discussion within their discipline about the epistemology that underlies it. So I thought it was good that he acknowledged that. And then he further wrote, forbidden archaeology is designed to demolish the case for biological and cultural evolution and to advance the cause of a Vedic alternative. Guilty as charged. So I thought it was good that he could detect what the purpose was, which wasn't really being hidden in any way, but I thought it was good to be acknowledged like this in the professional literature. Because the worst thing that can happen to you in the academic world is not to be noticed at all. I was at an academic conference once, and one of the scientists, one of the academics said to me, well, life in academia is like this. You're asking, thousands of people to notice you, and they all remain silent. That's academic death. Better to be criticized than agreed with instead of silence. So I thought it was good that this was being mentioned in the academic circles. And it's at this point where he says to advance the cause of a Vedic alternative that many scientists and academics get very nervous, because they get very nervous when anybody starts to mix science and religion. That makes them very nervous. And there are some in the scientific world who think that that should not be done at all. It's something that should be absolutely, totally forbidden. Say, to talk about the Book of Mormon in connection with archaeology, or to talk about the Bible, or the Quran, or the Vedic literature, the Mahabharata, or Ramayana. That, for some scientists and academics, that should be completely forbidden. The two things should be kept 100% separate. But there are some who have a different approach. And this next statement by Tim Murray, I think, is very interesting. He said, the dominant paradigm in archaeology has changed and is changing, and practitioners openly debate issues which go right to the conceptual core of the discipline. Whether the Vedas have a role to play in this is up to the individual scientist concerned. Now, that is a position I can accept wholeheartedly, and I think there shouldn't be any absolute ban on bringing in the Vedas or the Book of Mormon or whatever is inspiring one's research. But it's a decision that should be made by each individual scientist. And I think that is a position that I can accept. And it's what I talk about in my book, My Science, My Religion. So I'm going to end this by giving some experiences I have presenting this kind of information to university audiences in different parts of the world. My books are now published in about 20 different languages. One of the languages is Russian. I've been to Russia several times. I've spoken at universities from Vladivostok to Moscow to St. Petersburg. I've spoken at universities all over the country. And usually there's no problem. But in one university there was a little bit of a problem. This is the Tyumen State University, which is in the Texas of Russia, Siberia, in their oil country. It's where they get all their national wealth from. So it's a pretty big university, the Tyumen State University, and some professors there had invited me to talk about forbidden archaeology. And a lecture was scheduled, but the day before the lecture, the president of the university canceled the lecture. because other professors in the university had found out about the lecture and did not want me to speak there. And they objected for two reasons. First of all, I was contradicting the current theories of human origins. And second, I was doing it from a Vedic perspective. So either one of them would have been bad enough to give them some concern, but the two things together were more than they could stand. So they went to the president of the university and they convinced him to cancel the lecture. So the professors who invited me went to the president of the university and tried to get him to change his mind back, but he wouldn't. So then the professors who invited me, they went to the local branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and they spoke to the director there. And he said, well, if they won't let him speak at the university, he can speak here. So they had buses bring professors and students from the university to the Russian Academy of Science building, and the lecture was held there. And the professors who invited me said, more people came than would have come if the lecture had been held at the university, because everybody was talking. What is this man going to say? You know, that's so dangerous that the president of the university is canceling this lecture. So then, after the lecture, I had a private meeting with the director of the Russian Academy of Science branch and some of the scientists who liked what I said. And then the next year, something interesting happened. I went back to the same university and I spoke in the biology department there, no problem. I guess they learned their lesson. Better just let me speak. Let the students make up their own minds about what I have to say. And this doesn't happen just in Russia. It happened after my lecture got canceled here in Fort Wayne. I went to, was it Bloomington, Indiana? University of Indiana. Same thing happened there. I had been scheduled to give a lecture at the University of Indiana in Bloomington, but then some other faculty members found out about it, put pressure on the administration of the university, and that lecture was canceled. And I had to, I wound up giving a talk in the main city library in Bloomington, so I did get to talk. But if I didn't get forbidden a couple times a year, then no sense in calling myself the forbidden archaeologist. So, my books are out there, The Forbidden Archaeologist, and the classic Forbidden Archaeology, the shorter version, The Hidden History of the Human Race, and Human Devolution, a Vedic Alternative to Darwin's Theory, and the latest book, My Science, My Religion, which is 24 papers that I presented at mainstream scientific conferences, some of them published in peer-reviewed scientific literature, and an introductory essay where I lay out my whole rationale for mixing science and religion in the way that I do. I give a little biographical sketch of how it happened, why I do it. So, I want to thank Bruce Cunningham and all the other organizers for having me here today, and thank all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to hear something about forbidden archaeology. And I'm reachable, my website, Facebook page, Twitter, all there. Thank you very much. So I'm finished, Bruce. What now?
Is there any quick questions?
Yeah, one quick one.
I remember hearing.
Okay, yeah.
Well, go ahead.
Okay. I remember reading in one of the books on Mexican pyramids that there was an excavation on the western coast where they had dug down 75 or 80 feet and found pavement. Are you familiar with that?
I would have to hear more about what the exact report was, the place.
I'll send you an email.
Yeah, please do that.
I just found it really interesting that they would find something on such substantial architecture at that level.
There are reports like that. There are reports from coal mines in this country, like in Huebner, Oklahoma. It's one of the cases where back in the 1920s, there were some coal miners that were down 2 miles deep at a coal mine in Huebner, Oklahoma, and they were blasting out rooms. And that's what they call it. You know, they use dynamite, blast out a room, and start hauling the coal out of it. When they got to the end of one of the rooms, you know, they saw a big wall made of 6-inch square blocks of stone that were polished almost like a mirror. They reported it to the mine superintendents, and then they pulled them out of the mine, closed the mine, and sent them to another mine. You know, just one of those interesting cases. There are reports of architectural types of structures being found in very, very ancient contexts. So, one of the cases that I mentioned in Forbidden Archaeology. Frank Joseph has something to say.
What is the Vedic alternative?
The Vedic alternative would be another whole lecture, but to put it very simply, before we even ask the question, where did human beings come from, we should first ask the question, what is a human being? Now today, many scientists are going to say that a human being is just a machine made of molecules, a machine made of matter. Like Richard Dawkins, a prominent English scientist, says, we are survival machines, robot vehicles, blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. So according to that view, like our consciousness is just the result of chemicals interacting in the brain. You know, if you organize the chemicals in the brain in a sufficiently complex way, they generate what we call mind and consciousness, but only temporarily and only in association with those structures. And when those structures dissolve at the time of death, then there's no more consciousness, no more mind, nothing like that. So it's a very matter-based picture of what we are as conscious beings. Now the Vedic alternative proposes a consciousness-based understanding of what we are. Under that conception, consciousness can exist apart from the brain, apart from matter. So we are originally beings of pure consciousness who have come into association with matter and become covered by matter. So under that conception, you know, as conscious beings, we don't evolve up from matter. Rather, we devolve or come down from a level of pure consciousness. So basically, that's the alternative. And what we call bodies are vehicles for conscious selves that are produced by a higher intelligence to let conscious selves function on this level of reality. And just like as a human being, normally I'm meant to walk around on the land. If I want to exist under the water in an alien element, I need a submarine or a diving suit that's going to let me function in that alien element. So if a being of pure consciousness is going to function on the material level of reality, it needs a material vehicle that will allow it to function on that level. So there are lots of different kinds of vehicles. There's bird vehicles, animal vehicles, human vehicles, fish vehicles, insect vehicles, and they're designed to give conscious selves the ability to function according to their level of desire on this level of reality. But the real purpose of life is to restore consciousness to its original state. And there are a lot of spiritual disciplines and a lot of different traditions, different contemplative, meditative traditions that are meant to help people do that, restore consciousness to its original pure state.
So to summarize, we are spiritual beings having a physical experience, that old saying.
Yeah, or
In essence.
in the 1980s, there was a band called The Police that Sting was part of, and they had a song called "We Are Spirits in the Material World." So like that.
A real quick
quick follow-up is, so much of this is dependent on the processes and testing used to age, to tell us how old rock is and how old rock formations are. What is the best method to tell how old a rock formation is? There are 4 or 5 of them I'm gathering, but are they reliable, and do they use different ones to verify each other to tell us how old a given formation is?
All the methods are imperfect, but those are the methods that they use. So I'm in a discussion with the scientific community, and I have other sources of knowledge. You know, I accept Vedic statements as evidence, but they don't. They accept what you can get from their dating methods. So as far as I'm concerned, their dating methods appear to be based on relatively sound scientific principles, like the known rates of decay of various radioactive elements. Now, you could say maybe those observable rates of decay can't be verified for the past. You know, maybe the rates of decay differed in the past or something. That's possible. But in terms of my methodology, my method is to say to the scientific community, according to methods you consider reliable, like radiocarbon dating, potassium-argon dating, uranium series dating, electron spin resonance dating, and so forth, thermoluminescence dating, geomagnetic dating. According to methods you consider reliable, this formation or this bone or this artifact is so-and-so many million, of course, years old. Now, in the time spans that I'm mainly concerned with, millions of years, you cannot, there's no methods that will allow you to directly date bone that's millions of years ago, millions of years old. There is no method that will directly date a stone tool as being so many millions of years old. You have to date them according to the age of the layers of rock in which they were found. So my method is to say, according to methods that you consider reliable, the age of this formation is so-and-so many millions of years old. So how do you explain the presence in those layers of rock of this human bone or this human artifact or this human footprint? So they've got a couple of choices. Either they can say, well, our dating methods aren't reliable, which means we don't really know how old anything is, and we don't know anything, which is fine with me. Or they have to admit that their theories of human origins are wrong. Either way, I win.
So there's 6 or 7 methods. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, but I do, for the sake of argument, you know, accept that their dating methods are based on like maybe somebody who thinks the Earth is less than 10,000 years old would have more of a problem with the dating methods than I would. You know, as I think Stephen Knapp was mentioning in his presentation earlier this morning, Carl Sagan said the Vedic time scales are roughly equivalent to the modern scientific time scales. But I'm prepared to admit the dating methods could be wrong. Radiocarbon could be wrong, but my method is, according to say to scientists, according to methods you consider reliable, it's like this or that.